Wait for it to done. Cool. Hi everyone, happy British Science Week and welcome to our March Food for Thought seminar. I'm Elise Fahy and I'm part of the Food for Thought team at the Food Standards Agency. Before I introduce you to today's speakers, I would like to remind you of some housekeeping information. As this is a Microsoft webinar, you cannot unmute yourself or come on camera and the chat function is disabled. We do, however, welcome any questions or comments you may have along the way. You can post these at any time using the Q&A chat box. For today's seminar, I would like to provide a very warm welcome to the FSA's Johanna Jackson, Lauren Adams, Lorcan Browne and Anthony Wilson. Johanna, Lauren and Lorcan, led by Anthony, are part of the Microbiological Risk Assessment team at the FSA. The team are dedicated to ensuring consumer safety by evaluating the risk of microbiological hazards in foods. This session will be led by Johanna, Lauren and Lorcan, and Anthony will be joining the Q&A at the end to help answer your burning questions. With that, I'll hand over to our wonderful speakers for their talk, Beefing Up Safety, Understanding the Risks of Avian Flu in Dairy and Beef. From all of us at the Food for Thought team, we hope you enjoy the presentation today.
Hi, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm going to introduce the talk today, but we will, thank you for the thumbs up, we will divide the talk into three parts, and Joe and Lauren will take on the second two portions. So we're going to give a talk about the risks of avian influenza in relation to the outbreak of cattle-borne avian influenza in the US. We'll talk a little bit about the background to avian influenza, the timeline and spillover into US cattle, and then our work to date on assessing the risk that poses to UK consumers. Next slide. So very quickly, avian influenza is a virus. It was originally detected in Italy in the 19th century. It was called fowl plague at that point. It was initially actually slightly confused with another disease called fowl cholera, but that was later discovered to be as a result of a different bacterium, not a virus. And then in the 20th century, with the evolution of scientific tools, it was shown that this particular infection was as a result of a virus. And then in the 50s, the virus was isolated, actually in Scotland, and it was shown to be a type A influenza virus. And then in 1981, it was officially renamed to highly pathogenic avian influenza at the appropriately named Conference of Highly Pathogenic Avian Influenza. And then it really rocketed into public awareness and as a major impact on agriculture, on public health in the mid-90s with the outbreak of the H5N1 strain, which was first detected in birds in China. And in 1997, we had the first human case of H5N1 as a result of infection from poultry in Asia. And there's both highly pathogenic and low pathogenic, and they're largely distinguished by their severity, and they tend to be as a result of different strains of the virus. So it's had a huge international global impact in terms of the economic and agricultural impact. It spiraled into the billions. The infection and outbreaks of avian influenza usually result in mass cullings of birds. The last major outbreak, which was kind of 2021, 22, we saw a big spike in cases that resulted in billions of dollars worth of losses globally. I saw one report say that major outbreaks in Asia can reduce the entire GDP of countries by a percentile. And it usually results in large cullings of birds, including laying birds and meat birds. Next slide. Some of you may be seeing the sort of stories, and particularly in the States, about the soaring cost of eggs. And that's again related partly to inclement weather and other factors, but a large impact has been this outbreak of avian influenza, which has resulted in the culling of birds and large inflation in egg prices, but also other poultry products as well. Next slide. So avian influenza has circulated in birds for decades, and there have been, over that period, times when we have detected avian influenza or viruses of avian origin spilling over into mammalian species. So spillover essentially means that the virus jumps from a bird into a mammalian species. It can do this, but the virus doesn't survive particularly well in mammalian species. Some survive better than others, and that's largely down to how it genetically adapts to the host when it jumps over. And of course, the big worry here has been that we will get a jump into a mammalian species and there will be this high transmissibility across species. And obviously the worst case scenario would be if it could jump into humans and there would be a very high transmissibility. To date, that hasn't been the case. There have been jumps into mammalian species. In some species, it has spread. But largely in humans, we do get transmission from birds to humans. That's usually the cases you see in the news, but we haven't had sustained spread amongst humans. So to give you a bit of background on the timeline and the background to this risk assessment, in January of 2024, it was found that there was an outbreak of infection in US cattle. Well, actually, what was happening was farmers were observing that the cattle were losing weight and they were producing less milk. But initially, there was no cause being able to be identified. And this is actually because cows are not routinely tested for influenza. Cattle don't tend to, in general, contract influenza. And so for a while, we were unable to identify a cause. Then on a Texas farm in March of 2024, there were reports of cats who had died after drinking milk, waste milk from that farm. They were tested and they came back positive for influenza. It was then confirmed later that this was influenza A, and this led to the confirmation of avian influenza type A in cattle as well when they went back then to the farms and confirmed those samples. So in March, we had the first confirmation in cattle. And then soon after, in April 24, we found the first farm workers who had contracted H5N1 from cattle. And this is the first known human or cow to human transmission of H5N1. After that, we saw rapid spread of the virus across many states in the United States. The CDC also reported a number of cases of farm workers, again, mostly farm workers being infected. To date, we have 70 confirmed human cases in the most recent outbreak. 41 of those cases have been linked to close proximity to animals, and we've seen widespread increase in the virus across US dairy herds as well. Spread of the virus is probably as a result of obviously birds spreading the virus, but also there's the movement of infected animals, particularly from state to state. Also, some farms share their milking equipment, and we know that the virus can be quite high in milk and mammary glands, and also, the spread of infected animals. Next slide. So today, the most recent figures suggest that we're up to almost 1,000 herds in the US that have been infected across 17 states. There have been some restrictions on the movement of cattle, which has resulted in some restriction in the spread, but the hotspot has largely been California, which has a large agricultural and cow farming population. but it is across a lot of western and central US states as well. As I mentioned earlier, today we have 70 cases related to this outbreak. 41 have been linked to exposure to cattle, 24 of them to poultry. And so this just shows that this is jumping, or the close proximity to cattle can result in infection. Next slide. So the US have responded with restrictions in the movement of cattle, the restrictions and warnings on the sale of particularly raw milk products, and they've also issued orders on mandatory testing and mandatory reporting, which obviously is an attempt to get on top of this and get a better idea of the spread of the disease. So why is it a concern in food? So alongside the drop in milk and the loss of weight that farmers were seeing in their cattle with the spread of this virus, one of the other observations was that the milk that was being produced, particularly in very infected cattle, could often be discolored, it can be thickened, and you can see here, these are some pictures of showing particularly thickened and coagulated milk samples. So obviously the concern was that virus may be passing from these dairy cattle into the milk itself. And testing that was carried out by the FDA found that bulk milk samples, so bulk milk is where farms send all their milk, which is then combined into large vats, which is then sent out and pasteurized. But testing from these bulk milk containers, which can contain 600 to 700 different farms, they were finding many of the samples were coming back positive. And in some of those samples as well, they were detecting live viral particles. So this was suggesting that the virus could indeed be transmitted through milk. And also some work that looked at testing of retail products also found that viral DNA was present in 1 of 5 dairy products from retail stores. Now, in that case, the virus was not live virus, but it did suggest that milk that was being used to produce these had been at some point infected. As I mentioned earlier, the main reports of infection from cattle have come from farm workers. So these are ones that have been in close contact working with cattle. And to date, the symptoms have been relatively mild. They've been limited to mild respiratory symptoms and conjunctivitis. Next slide. But to date, we've no confirmed cases where the virus has been transmitted to humans through food. So to date, we have no reports from the current outbreak that it has been infected, but also more generally, this has been a topic that has been the focus of consideration for some time. And to date, we have no evidence that avian influenza of any strain can be reliably transmitted to humans through the consumption of food. And EFSA, in their 2006 report, concluded that there was no epidemiological evidence to suggest that it's transmitted through food. We also we have some anecdotal cases, some reports of cases where people may have become infected. But these tend to be quite unique circumstances where somebody may have, for instance, eaten raw flesh or raw blood of an animal and become infected, but we don't have strong evidence that can rule out other routes of exposure. But what it does suggest is that if people are becoming infected from consuming food, it's probably in circumstances where the level of virus is very high. And we have this idea of infectious dose in in microbiology, which is the minimum number of viruses or bacteria that would be required in order to cause an infection. So what we imagine if it is possible to contract avian influenza from food, the infectious dose is probably going to be very high. And in that case, that's at least one reassuring fact. Next slide. Okay, I think at this point I'm handing over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you, Lorcan. So after the FDA confirmed that HPAI had been detected in dairy cattle that had been displaying a drop in milk production alongside other sort of clinical signs, as well as the detection in raw bulk milk and pasteurized milk on sale in America, the Food Standards Agency responded by producing a rapid risk assessment that was published in May 2024. The main purpose of this risk assessment was to determine the risk to UK consumers from HPAI strain B3.13 in imported milk and dairy products that had originated from US cattle. So it's just a brief summary. The risk was assessed to be very low, which means that the frequency of occurrence is very rare but cannot be excluded. This was because imports from the US are low and the products that are being imported are likely to undergo processing, which is highly likely to inactivate any infectious virus present. However, I will go into more detail on these factors later on in the presentation. At the time of producing the risk assessment, it was not certain whether some products would undergo sufficient processing to eliminate the virus. This included products such as dried milk powder, and there had also been no detection in meat products. However, new information emerged regarding these points, and 3 new risk assessments were commissioned and published in February 2025, which is what the rest of this presentation is focused on. Next slide, please. So the first of the 3 new risk assessments was an update to the one published in May 2024, and it considered new evidence such as the viral load in milk, the efficacy of pasteurization, and also the processing requirements of dairy products imported from the US to the UK. Additionally, the scope was expanded to cover the risk from beef and other beef products, but this will be covered later in the presentation. And for now, I will focus on the dairy side of the risk assessment. Next slide, please. So milk from subclinical and also visibly sick cows can enter the food chain due to a lack of detection, errors, and also possibly non-compliance. So as a result of the US Food and Drug Administration, they tested the raw milk from large bulk tanks, which again held milk from approximately 600 to 700 cows. And this testing was done in areas with known and also unknown cases of infection. So they tested 275 raw milk samples, of which just less than 60% were positive for viral RNA. Of these positive samples, 25% contained infectious virus. So the study showed that the amount of virus also varied between the samples, and this ranged from approximately 20 viral particles per mil to 2 million viral particles per mil of milk. Therefore, our main takeaway was that milk from infected cattle can contain very high levels of virus and also live virus. Next slide, please. The next step of this risk assessment was then to determine the efficiency of pasteurization. So pasteurization is a process that involves heating milk to high temperatures followed by rapid cooling, and this helps ensure that harmful microorganisms are eliminated. There are different methods for pasteurization, but the most common methods include high temperature short time methods, also known as HTST, where milk is heated to approximately 72 degrees for 15 seconds, as well as low temperature long time methods, where milk is heated to 63 degrees for 30 minutes. So researchers added the highest amount of HPAI virus found in bulk milk, which was roughly about 2 million viral particles per mil, to test the effectiveness of these pasteurisation methods. So for low temperature, long time pasteurisation methods, research showed that the infectious virus was highly reduced. They achieved a reduction of more than 6 logs. So this means that over 99.999% of the virus was eliminated. Therefore, if milk contains 2 million viral particles per mil, then the low temperature long time pasteurisation would leave approximately 2 viral particles per mil. Additionally, in 7 out of 8 tests, the high temperature short time pasteurisation method also reduced the virus by more than 6 logs. However, in 1 out of the 8 tests, the high temperature short time pasteurisation reduced the viral amount by 4.4 log. So this means that there's a reduction by around about 99.996%. Therefore, if the starting concentration was again around 2 million viral particles per mil, then a 4.4 log reduction would leave approximately 72 viral particles per mil. However, there was also one other study that suggested that the efficacy of pasteurisation is inversely related to sample size. So pasteurising large volumes may be less effective compared to pasteurising small volumes. Next slide, please. So after determining that pasteurisation is highly effective at reducing the amount of infectious virus, the next step was to look at how much dairy and dairy products are being imported into the UK from the United States, and also confirming whether the products are likely to be pasteurised or not. So it was reported that over 5 billion kilograms of dairy produce were purchased at retail in the UK between January and November 2024. However, in the sort of same time period, a total of just over 1 million kilograms of milk and dairy products were imported from USA. Therefore, it can be estimated that only 0.01% of the UK dairy market is imported from the United States. Additionally, since 1987, the FDA requires dairy products that are exported internationally to be pasteurised, or in the case of cheese, can be made with unpasteurised milk, but must be aged for a minimum of 60 days. So out of the 1 million kilograms of imported US dairy products, a maximum of just over 8,000 kilograms are cheese that may be unpasteurised but aged for 60 days. Therefore, over 99% of US imported dairy products will be pasteurised. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned aged cheese in the previous slide, I also just want to touch upon some survival characteristics of H5N1. This is because it's likely that some dairy products may naturally reduce the infectivity of the virus based on their physiochemical properties. So for example, H5N1 viruses have been shown to lose infectivity at acidic and also alkaline pH levels, but remain stable at neutral pHs. So the virus also survives better at lower temperatures, sort of below 4 degrees, which is sort of refrigeration temperatures, and also in low salinity environments. So different dairy products have varying pHs, salinity, water activity that may all affect the virus's infectivity. So for instance, there was a study using homemade yogurt with an acidic pH around about 4 that reduced the virus's infectivity. However, other products such as ice cream, which have a more neutral pH, may not affect the viral infectivity. Therefore, things like aged cheese made with unpasteurised milk may have reduced viral infectivity because of sort of other processing factors and their physicochemical properties. However, there is still a massive evidence gap in this area, and further research is still needed into the viral survival and infectivity in different dairy products. Next slide, please. As it was confirmed that US dairy products, with the exception of aged cheese, must be pasteurised, and that pasteurisation is highly effective at reducing infective virus, the probability that UK consumers will receive infectious exposures to HPAI was lowered from very low in the May 2024 assessment to being negligible in this assessment. So this means that the frequency of occurrence of foodborne risk is so rare that it does not merit to be considered. Next slide, please. So the second risk assessment considered the hypothetical risk to UK consumers from HPAI B313 in milk, dairy products, colostrum and colostrum-based products. And this was if the virus was found to be circulating in UK dairy cattle. However, just to reiterate, this was a hypothetical assessment, and that currently there has been no detection in the UK. So also an important note for this assessment is that it differs from the US assessment, as we consider the risk per portion of product rather than a population-based risk. Therefore, we are determining the risk to an individual from a single exposure. Next slide, please. So as discussed in the US risk assessment, in a worst case scenario, bulk milk could contain approximately 2 million viral particles per mil. Pasteurisation can also significantly reduce the viral load by more than 6 logs. However, the high temperature short time pasteurisation for one replicate showed a 4.4 log reduction. Therefore, using this reduction as a worst case scenario alongside the highest detection in bulk milk, it can be estimated that pasteurised milk would have a low number of viral particles per mil of milk. And additionally, the average glass of drinking milk is around about 150 mils. Therefore, if you apply the worst case scenario, an individual consuming a glass of pasteurised milk may be exposed to a small amount of virus. However, this amount is approximately 100 times less than our sort of hypothesised infectious dose, which again is the amount required to make someone ill. Next slide, please. So in addition to milk and milk products, colostrum-based products were also in scope for this risk assessment. So colostrum is the first form of milk released by the mammary glands after birth and has a pH of around about 6.4. There have been incidents of cats with respiratory and neurological signs from HPAI affected farms, and it's believed to have resulted from cats consuming raw milk or even raw colostrum. So bovine colostrum can be used in a sort of preserved form. This includes powders, liquids, tablets and capsules, and has been used as sort of dietary supplements. There's not a lot of evidence to determine the level of virus in colostrum, therefore it's sort of assumed that it would be similar to raw milk, and that pasteurisation is also likely to have the same effect. Next slide, please. Therefore, this risk assessment determined the probability that UK consumers being exposed to an infectious level of the virus via either a portion of pasteurised drinking milk, dairy products made with pasteurised milk, and even pasteurised or processed colostrum to be negligible. So again, this is so rare that it does not merit to be considered. Next slide, please. The next part of the assessment focused on raw cows drinking milk, which is abbreviated to RCDM, and also unpasteurised dairy products. So just as some brief background, raw cows drinking milk is not subjected to heat treatment. This includes pasteurisation. It is permitted for sale in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, but it is totally banned in Scotland. So while the sale of the product is legal, it is also restricted to how it can be sold, and this includes at registered farms, farmers markets and direct online sales. And dairy products can also be made with unpasteurised milk and sold throughout the UK. So there's no exhaustive list of unpasteurised milk dairy products that can be sold in the UK, but a brief Google search showed that there is online sales of butter, cream, ice cream and yoghurt that are all made with unpasteurised milk. Colostrum can also be sold raw directly from farms in a similar way to raw milk. Next slide, please. So again, as before, using the same worst case scenario of infectious levels taken from the bulk milk, it can be estimated that a 150ml glass of raw cow's drinking milk could have well over the 2 million viral particles, which worked out to be approximately 31 times higher than the hypothesized infectious dose. And as previously mentioned, there is currently no extensive data available on the persistence and infectivity of strain B3.13 in dairy products made with unpasteurised milk. Therefore, this assessment again applied a precautionary approach and assumed that a significant level of the virus may still be present. Next slide, please. So as raw cow's drinking milk, dairy products made with unpasteurised milk and also raw colostrum can contain enough virus to make someone sick. The assessment found that UK consumers may be regularly exposed to infectious levels of the virus in these products. This means that the risk was considered to be medium. And I will now pass over to Jo for the next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. And so I've got my slides to work here. So I'm going to jump back to the updated risk assessment that we did back in sort of to consider the US imports. So I'm going to consider the risk assessments that looked at beef and beef products from now on. So when looking at the updated risk assessment, as Lauren said already, it was to provide an update to the risk considering the new information that had come to light in scientific evidence since the May 2024 risk assessment had been completed. And this was to expand the scope of the assessment to include beef and other beef products that were exported to the UK from the USA. There's reasons for this. So when the initial risk assessment was completed, there was no evidence of H5N1 in beef products. And actually, there's still very little evidence now. And there's certainly not any evidence, as far as we're aware, that it's circulating in the beef herd, which is reassuring. However, we estimate, or we've sort of seen figures of anywhere between sort of 5 and 20% of US beef actually comes from the dairy sector, so it's made up from spent dairy cows going for slaughter. We assume this to be the lower quality cuts of meat, such as going for ground beef, but there's still a risk that dairy cattle will end up as UF beef and potentially exported to the UK. As of May 2024, APHIS, the American Plant Health Inspection Agency, started a survey of condemned dairy cattle. So these are dairy cattle that were known to have H5N1, so they're showing clinical signs. They weren't going to enter the food chain, but they went for slaughter. So they've been taking muscle samples since then, and they've taken 333 samples to date. So that isn't more than 333 cattle have virus present. That is out of 333 samples taken to date, the condemned poorly cattle with clinical signs of H5N1. Only one of those, so less than 0.5% of those muscle samples have shown viable virus present. As far as I'm aware, APHIS haven't actually published those full sets of results. It's more just an update on their website. So we don't have any information on the sort of quantity of virus, but the note beside it says it's at very low levels. So the muscle samples they've been taken in the diaphragm, of that one cow that tested positive in the diaphragm, they also found virus in the kidney. But they've looked at all the cows I think have been looked at. They've been looking at the quote usual cuts of meat that go for consumers. And they haven't found presence of any virus in any of those usual cuts, which again is reassuring. So in a study sort of allied to this, a sort of paper that's published by Assessors et al. Sort of last year, we're also taking samples from condemned dairy cattle. So these are poorly cattle with clinical signs of H5N1 at slaughter. And so they did post-mortems of 3 dairy cattle, and they looked for presence of sort of viral RNA throughout the cow sort of systemically. Unsurprisingly, from what Lauren and Lorcan have already said, there was high levels, particularly very high levels, actually found in the mammary glands. And the evidence we've got today is this virus is potentially hypothetically being transmitted maybe through milking equipment, and we know that there's high levels in milk. So the fact there's high levels in mammary glands isn't a surprise. We didn't actually consider specifically in the risk assessment eating mammary glands, but it's later come to light that there are recipes out there if you Google them. There are dishes available, sort of Chinese cuisine and French as well, using the mammary gland. So potentially that is an area. I think it was in the region of nearly 8 logs of virus found in the mammary glands. And sort of it follows as well that there was quite high levels of virus as well found in the supramammary lymph nodes as well, because obviously close proximity to the mammary glands. This group also detected viable virus in the lung. It's a respiratory pathogen. It's probably not is a flu. It's probably not surprising, but this is at lower levels, so in the region of 3 logs. But also it was detected in the small intestine as well in all 3 cattle at lower levels. So I think combined with sort of the fact it was found in the kidney in the 1 cow from the APHIS study that I showed before in the diaphragm, although it doesn't seem to be sort of being spread in sort of one sample out of these clinically affected cows, there is a potential for this virus to be systemic throughout an infected cow. I said before that the APHIS study has also been looking at the usual cuts of meat, so I assume this kind of is your usual roasting joints and steaks, etc. But as I said, because of I'm guessing it's because of spent dairy cattle that sort of entering the beef chain in the US. And that's more likely to end up as the cheaper cuts of meat. APHIS conducted a study in May 2024 of looking at ground or minced beef, as we'd call it in the UK, tested at retail. And this was from retail outlets in states where dairy cattle herds had tested positive for the virus. We don't have any information on how many samples were taken, but they reported that no viral particles were found to be present in these studies, which again is reassuring. So looking at the trade volumes, as Lauren already did with the dairy, we do import US beef to the UK, but it is at low levels or very low levels. So looking sort of for the UK as a whole, is around 774 million kilograms of beef is eaten per year in the UK. And in the year from January 24 to November 24, only 18,396 kilos were imported from the US. Interestingly, this is quite significantly lower than in previous years. We've seen sort of in 2022-23, around 100,000 kilos were imported from the US. So it has decreased. This is a real figure. It's not sort of a delayed reporting or anything. We don't know the reasons behind this, but so the amount of beef that was imported in the last year was very, very low proportion of the total amount of beef that's consumed within the UK. And just to note, sort of beef imported to the UK from the US is subject to strict tariffs and strict rules as well, such as no sort of hormone supplemented beef as well. So moving on to sort of processing, if you like, of beef. So as Lauren has already presented the results in pasteurisation, the early results or the results so far suggest that pasteurisation is pretty effective generally at reducing H5N1 in milk. And actually there's only been limited studies, but the one study that has been carried out to date, it was by Luchansky et al., who took great big lumps of minced beef and made their own burgers. These were reported to be huge beef burgers of 300 grams region, and they artificially inoculated it with very, very high levels of H5N1, of B313, actually. And then they subjected the beef burgers to different cooking temperatures. And the encouraging things from this is the thoroughly cooked burgers. So those that reached an internal temperature of 71 degrees. So I've got a little chart on the right-hand side just to give a guide to how you should cook your meat. That's a rib, but I guess it'd be similar sort of temperatures for beef burgers as well. So 71.1 being well done. And after this ultra-high inoculation of virus to the beef burger, there was no virus detected at the end of cooking, and it took around 20 minutes to get to temperature. They also subjected to temperatures of over 63 degrees, which sort of equates to sort of medium well. And this temperature also significantly reduced the virus. I think it actually did reduce it to below the levels of detection as well. So that was encouraging. And even in the rare cooked burgers, temperatures equivalent to the bottom end of the rare sort of 49 degrees rare scale. Although it didn't eliminate all the virus or reduce below the level of detection, it did significantly reduce the level of virus. So again, this is all very encouraging evidence. As part of the risk assessment, the UK risk assessment, which I'll come to in a minute, we sort of specifically considered less than thoroughly cooked and raw meat, and we consider this during the risk assessment. I said the cooking study that I presented in the previous slide suggests that actually even rare temperatures are going to be pretty effective at mitigating sort of the risk of the virus. And burgers as well, sort of less than thoroughly cooked burgers can be produced by businesses in this country against sort of strict guidelines. And in the risk assessment, we assessed those different methods of cooking burgers for less than thoroughly cooked. And we sort of concluded that probably sous vide cooking was effective, but had more concerns about the sear and shave and source control that would be effective for bacterial reduction and control, but less so for virus, because we don't understand the sort of dissemination, if you like, of the virus throughout the cow completely. We're looking at raw meat, so products such as beef carpaccio and beef steak tartare. We concluded that because this isn't going under any heat treatment, no cooking. And from the next slide, I'll show you that, and as Lauren touched on previously, virus is quite good at surviving at low temperatures. It's likely that if there was any viable virus in that product, then it could remain stable and viable during the shelf life. And sort of just going on to storage again, so dragging back up to what Lauren already talked about, sort of survival at low temperatures. As you know, beef and beef products are generally stored at chilled and frozen temperatures. That's probably the exception of products like beef jerky. And studies from poultry meat confirm that H5N1 and actually studies with other viruses as well suggest that it's quite good at surviving in muscle for extended periods of time. I think at 4 degrees, I think H5N1 was quite good at surviving for around 160 days. Viruses survive better at lower temperatures. So I think in similar studies at ambient temperatures, I think it was up to 30-day survival, but I'm not sure anyone would want to eat it after that time. Okay. So we also considered supplements. So beef and beef products can be made into supplements. And so we started to look into what sorts of beef, particularly beef offal, are made into supplements that are commonly available in the UK. And essentially what we concluded from this, if you name an organ, you can find it in a supplement. So searches on common sort of websites that supply supplements, for example, Amazon, show that US and UK produced supplements can be readily purchased in the UK. On the table on the left is sort of just a brief summary of some of the ones we found. So there's one that contains liver, heart, kidney, pancreas and spleen. All I can say is we don't know how many of these supplements are purchased in the UK per year. We don't know sort of how much is consumed, and we don't know the sort of processing that these supplements undergo, but I just thought I'd flag it as an area sort of uncertainty really that we find during the risk assessments. So considering all the information that I presented just now, the updated risk assessment looking at sort of US imports to the UK found that the probability that UK consumers will receive an infectious exposure to influenza of avian origin from imported beef and beef products is negligible. So that's so rare, it doesn't merit consideration. So jumping back again to the UK risk assessment then, I said, so this is included in the risk assessment that Lauren already talked about dairy. So it's on a per portion basis. So it's looking at the risk from a single portion, a single exposure. And this risk assessment, the scope was to understand sort of beef and beef products, thoroughly cooked beef, minced beef and offal, less than thoroughly cooked beef and raw beef. So it's taken into all the evidence that I've already presented. And again, like the dairy risk assessment, it was in the hypothetical scenario of an outbreak of B313 in the UK, and there is currently no evidence that it is circulating in our cattle. And sort of alongside all the evidence we presented already about sort of cooking and survival and mitigations, one thing sort of to flag is in the UK we've got really robust systems at slaughterhouses to ensure that animals are fit for consumption, that are not fit for consumption, sorry, are detected and withdrawn from the food chain. And therefore, even if an animal did present for slaughter, they get through other sort of other hurdles, and which is unlikely, and it was showing clinical signs of H5N1, then these would be detected and removed from the food chain accordingly. So taking into sort of all the evidence I presented again, the probability that UK consumers will receive infectious exposures of avian flu by a portion of thoroughly cooked beef meat, offal and minced beef to be negligible, less than thoroughly cooked negligible as well. So that's so rare it doesn't merit consideration, and raw beef to be very low. So that is very rare but cannot be excluded, and that's because of the no cooking, if you like, the no further processing of raw beef, such as steak tartare and beef carpaccio. So just to talk a little bit about uncertainties, I won't go to it in too much depth. So whenever we write risk assessments, there's always uncertainties, there's things that we don't know, and these sort of alongside a risk or a probability of exposure, we also give an uncertainty in that evidence as well. So the key uncertainties, there's numerous uncertainties, but the key ones really that could impact this are the general, we don't have any evidence really on the severity of illness in vulnerable groups, or if there are more severe illnesses from B313. And as Lorcan said at the very beginning, we've still got no confirmation of foodborne exposure or resulting severity from this route. So we don't even know if it can occur. Regarding dairy, was still the slight uncertainty of the efficacy of pasteurisation. So low temperature short time seems to be effective, but there's some slight discrepancies in the results from the high temperature short time. And as Lauren gave a really good overview, the impact of dairy product processing on viral infectivity, because there's so many different dairy products with so many different processes that are involved. There is an evidence gap there. And with beef, as I said, I've touched on the fact that there are limited studies showing that only very few cattle presenting with clinical signs have evidence of virus in beef muscle, but we'd like more evidence on the distribution and tighter sort of level, if you like, of virus in beef muscle of infected cattle and offal. And also the variations in process and temperatures that are used to produce less than thoroughly cooked meat, foods as well could impact on those risks. And that is it. So whistle stop the tour of avian flu in cattle. Thank you for listening, and any questions?
Thank you so much, Lorcan, Lauren and Johanna, for an amazing presentation. It was so interesting. I'd like to invite Anthony Wilson to also join as we move on to the Q&A part of the session. So we've actually got quite a few questions that have come through. So I'll start from the bottom first. So is all milk positively released in the USA now for avian influenza? Look.
Anthony, do you know that at all?
I don't think they're not testing everything. No, there are some we're getting some information through from US authorities currently. I believe they're still completing some testing of milk, but it's not positive release it's operating under.
Okay. Thank you. So when you say known transmission via food, does that include raw milk? Could the farm workers that were infected have been consuming raw dairy milk? And I think that's talking about transmission to the farmers. Yeah.
I can come in as well on that if you like. It's possible. We don't have any evidence that they are doing it, and it is likely that they've had environmental exposure. So since we know that you can get environmental exposure via aerosol and droplet infections when they're in close proximity with cattle, we know that that transmission pathway exists. We have no evidence whether or not they may have also been consuming milk. What we have seen is that those who are not in close environmental proximity to cattle are not mostly showing infection.
Thank you. So is anyone testing cattle in the UK for avian influenza at the moment?
Yeah, I think let's do that.
I'm doing this one again. DEFRA's been doing some testing of bulk milk samples. They initially designed a study, which I think the details of which were published, but they designed a study that was looking was statistically powered that it would have allowed the detection of avian flu if it was present at above minimal levels in UK milk. You can't test again unless you're testing every glass of milk in the UK. You can't confirm it's not present in any of them, but it found no positives, which confirms our suspicion that it's not been introduced into UK cattle. And in combination with that, again, we haven't seen any suspicious clinical signs. We haven't had any evidence of circulation in UK cattle, so we're moderately confident that's not taking place.
Thank you very much. So another question, do you think there could be some clear hurdles agreed soon for a processing site's HACCP to reduce the risk of avian influenza in products?
That's possibly verging on a policy question, and policy colleagues weren't able to join us for this talk. But I think certainly if you're so as Joe's part of the talk amply demonstrated, but was mentioned in the other parts as well, heat treatment is extremely effective in meat and appears to be pretty effective in dairy as well in terms of massively reducing, if not eliminating, virus when it's present even at fairly high levels, combined with the fact that it tends not to be present in muscle tissue in the first place. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a message popping up. So yes, so I think we are. I think the critical controls in this place, if there were heat-based controls, they're probably best. There are also, as we've said, in terms of dairy health monitoring and slaughter, you would expect if animals are showing clinical signs consistent with this infection, it would be picked up in terms of routine health inspections and pre-mortem inspections as well.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, and just on that, then just to say that in February of this year, the FDA did issue guidance to US producers of raw meat products and raw pet food products to basically, along that lines, to review their hygiene policies in light of the spread of the virus.
Thank you very much. Okay, so another question. Can you say more about the symptoms in dairy and beef animals besides loss in weight and yield drop? What should be looked for?
I don't know if we can say a huge amount of that within the time we have on this talk, but what we can do is we can talk to veterinary colleagues and get a list of symptoms that have reported so far. I think I would also emphasize that particularly in the case of where we've seen in dairy cattle, we're not seeing widespread dissemination through all tissues. We might not necessarily expect there to be severe clinical signs in all cases of infection. The muscle tissue, the work looking at dissemination of virus in muscle tissue, particularly in smooth muscle and diaphragm, was focusing on animals that were so severely clinically ill that they had been sent for culling and weren't entering the food chain. So you would expect that in other cases you could get infection without clinical signs of that severity.
Yeah, there's also, so on that point, there is a lot of circulation in subclinical animals. That means that they won't show symptoms. However, there is some encouraging news on that. The studies have shown that milk from those animals contains considerably lower viral amounts than animals that are clinical. So again, that might be good in terms of what Joe had mentioned earlier about the fact that our processes in the UK to weed out any animals with clinical infections should ensure some protection to UK consumers.
Thank you very much. Another question. Do we know what proportion of UK consumers are likely to consume raw or unpasteurised dairy?
Yeah, I think I can briefly add that one. I don't think we had much data on that at all. So it wasn't mentioned in the risk assessment, a proportion of the population or even a rough value in kilograms of raw dairy milk consumed. So unfortunately, I just don't think that information is currently available.
Thank you. So another question. Given the current avian influenza control zones in place in England, would it be prudent to test milk from dairy farms in those regions? Yeah.
And that might be one of those ones again where it's a policy and an ops question, but yeah, I mean, my gut feeling would definitely be yes. But it's yeah, unfortunately, we'd probably need a policy colleague.
I would also add, I guess, that from this, we're in the situation, as we often are with zoonotic pathogens, where we're looking at animal health risk as well as human health risk, given that the conclusion of our assessments is that actually most of the time that virus is not present in muscle tissue in the vast majority of cases and is effectively inactivated by many of the controls that would normally be in place during processing. The response to this in terms of UK testing is being led by DEFRA from the perspective this is predominantly an animal health issue that may also have some human health impacts, which is what we're considering. But predominantly this is about cattle health now, so that's a DEFRA-led issue.
Thank you very much. Is there any action now being proposed following the medium risk findings for raw milk?
I'm not aware of any. I'll come in there at the moment because it's not actually we don't import any sort of non-pasteurized dairy, with the exception of that small portion of aged cheese from the US, and it's not circulating currently in UK cattle, as far as we're aware. So I'm not sure of any other actions at the moment.
That one again, I think we may have to take back to policy colleagues and come back. I also noted, I'm afraid the question is a bit long to read out, but I noticed Ash from APHA was asking us about, I think it's been addressed in the comments. I was just trying to draft a written response, but a couple of people beat me to it. Just to re-emphasize that so the 3 assessments that we published recently, one of them is an update to the assessment of risk to UK consumers from US product, which we originally published in May last year. The other 2 are hypothetical risks to UK consumers in the event that the viral strain becomes established in the UK herd. That's stated in the title, it's stated in the abstract, it's stated in the lay summary. I'm hoping that is clear to the majority of the audience, but it's worth re-emphasising.
Thank you, that's really helpful. So I think we have time for one more question. Again, very interesting topic. Do you know what engagement there's been with farms and suppliers regarding what to look out for in animals that may be showing signs of avian flu?
I'm assuming that's in the UK, although from the context. That again would be a DEFRA lead, I think, because this is, I don't know if we have anyone from DEFRA who's able to provide a comment in the chat. from our perspective, again, DEFRA is taking the lead responsibility on this because most of the products will then be processed in a way that will eliminate any virus that's present or significantly reduce any virus that's present, and it's therefore not likely to represent a food safety risk, even if the virus became established. And as a result of that assessment, it's reinforced the position that the main concern of this from a UK perspective is animal health, which means that this would be a DEFRA-led area, and DEFRA will be liaising with industry about this.
Thank you very much. Just check if we've got anything else. I think that's the right time to end this webinar today. So thank you so much, everyone. If your question didn't get answered today, please feel free to send it over to us at foodforthought@food.gov.uk, and we can coordinate with the speakers. The seminar recording will be available on our YouTube channel, and this channel also includes recordings from previous seminars. Before we close, I also want to flag that if you're not already on the Food for Thought mailing list, you can sign up via the link that we'll just post in the chat now. If you'd like to get in touch, please email us at foodforthought@food.gov.uk, or if you're at the FSA, you can search for our page on the intranet. We love receiving ideas for future speakers, and if you're at the FSA and would like to get involved in volunteering in the Food for Thought team, then please also get in touch. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.